This podcast is produced by the Harwood Productions Podcast Network. To learn more about the network and to find more of our shows, visit us online at www.harwoodpodcast.com.
Hi, I'm Helene Woods, and this is Let's Quilt, episode number 25. We're going to start out today by straightening and finishing our block. And as you sew it together, you're going to notice that some of the seams are not quite meeting here. So let's straighten those up, and I'll show you how. First, you want to take your block and find a horizontal line here that you want to lay it on, and then one on vertically. And I have here some that are sticking out a little bit too far. So I'm going to take my ruler, I'm going to lay that, and I'm going to get a straight edge here, and as you can see, the tan is sticking out a little bit. So I'm just going to take my cutting wheel, I'm going to go along, hold this nice and tight, and just cut that off, and see how that makes it nice and straight. And then, as I happen to do, I just keep turning it. And as I go along, I can see other edges that are not correct, and so I'll just go along and cut those, trim those off also. So now we can go ahead and cut out our flannel for our inside, and then I have my lining here. I'm going to cut that also. So you can really just take those and put them down on your fabric, and I have my block right here. And I can just go ahead and trim all the way around that, so I know that it'll be nice and even. If you want to, you can pin it, but I think if you just press it down a little bit, it should be fine, because if you pin it, then make your ruler not be level. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut these off. I'm going to take this and trim it off that way, so that I can turn that, and then I can get this out of the way. So here it is, all nice and trimmed. We've got our lining all right on the right side, and we're ready to stitch in the ditch. I like to use our 505 temporary fabric spray to have our pieces all stick together. But I want to protect my cutting board too. So what I'm just going to take my little frame that I have here, I'm going to turn it over, and then I'm going to put down my pieces. I'm going to spray it on the back of the flannel, and then it just takes a second. And then put that back on top of there, smooth it out a little bit, and then I'm going to spray the other side of the flannel, and I'm going to put my top of my quilt on that. And as you say, it just takes a second to get that down, and it doesn't hurt the canvas here, and it works out. It makes the easy way to do this. So here it is, all stuck together. Now I'm going to start stitching. Now, before we start to do our stitching in our ditches, I want to remind you to put your walking foot on, and there again we're going to use the nylon filament thread, so it won't be noticeable. Now when we stitch in the ditch, we want to come and we're going to try very hard to stitch right on this seam as we come down. Now in a case like this, it's so small, you can go ahead and just pick up your foot and just continue on, and just make sure that you get all of the seams sewn. And we have to remember to bring up our bottom thread. So I have another little tool that I'm going to show you that I think you might like to have in your little sewing box, and it's any kind of a long tweezer. and it comes in really handy. So you can put your foot down, put your needle down, put your foot down, and hold on to your thread, and we'll bring up the bottom thread. There, and then you have your tweezer just to grab that and pull it through. Okay, now we're going to stitch. Now I've come to a little intersection here. I can just raise my foot up, angle it off, and continue on stitching in that seam. And then I want you to take your scissors and just trim off all those little pieces of thread and make this nice and clean. You may have some that are up on the block itself. Clean this up before we put our binding on. Now in our previous binding that we put on, we've used a double fold, but on this little block here, it's really not necessary. So we're just going to use a single fold binding. So what you're going to do is take your long piece of binding and fold it in two and just press it. And please try not to stretch it. Just lay your iron on top of it and that should hold it. Now if it looks like it's not going to stay there, you can go ahead and spray starch it, and that will help it. Now as we start to putting our binding on, I want to make sure that you bring it over a little, about an inch or so past the center of your binding, and we'll put it right there. Now we're not going to start stitching right there, but I want you to make sure that you have enough. So figure another inch past the center of your binding, and we're going to pin that on. As we have this pinned here, and I want to show you this before I start to stitch. We're going to measure back from our edge of our block itself 1/4 of an inch. So with this here, I'm going to put a little mark there with my pencil. I'm going to stitch right along here at 1/4 of an inch till we get to our dot, and we're going to stop. We're going to back stitch and release the block from the machine. Then we're going to take this and we're going to fold this up. Make this nice and even. Just like that. Square it off, and then when you start to stitch again, you're going to start right up here at the very edge and come down your 1/4 of an inch. And you're going to do that all the way along until we get back over to where to the edge over here. And I'll show you that when I get to that place on the sewing machine. We're going to start stitching now, but I wanted to tell you that I went ahead and changed to a darker thread so that you can actually see the stitching as I'm going along. Now I have it all laid out here, but be sure you leave this free. And so we're going to start stitching about at the middle. And we're going to use 1/4 inch. And here's something else you can start. You might back stitch here a couple of stitches too, just to make sure that it stays there. I'm going to stitch on down. There I'm at my dot. I'm going to back stitch there a couple of stitches, and then I'm going to cut it off, the thread off, and then we're going to release it from the machine. Now at this time is when we're going to bring this up all the way, make it level with the top part of your block, and at this time you can go ahead and pin that so that you hold it there. And we'll go ahead and stitch this on down, and I'm going to measure at this time 1/4 of an inch back, and I'll put another dot there. There. And now stitch along this line, and there again you start way up at the top just like you would on a brand new seam. Bring your needle down. There. I'm going to stop again at the dot, back stitch, and release it. And we're going to do this the same way. We're going to bring that up, fold it up, nice and even, and you can pin that. I'm going to bring this down to where it would be, and I'm going to measure up another 1/4 of an inch, just like we did before. All right, now I'm going to continue stitching this on down, and we've got this long tail left over. What you want to do is, this is loose, so we're going to cut this off, say like halfway through where that is. Cut this off there. Then we're going to take this and we're going to open up the back part here of our binding, and we're just going to slip this little tail right inside of that. There. So then that makes it all nice and covered. If you would like to, you might take this tail and you could turn it in 1/4 of an inch so you had a nice even seam. That depends upon you. I'm going to try and see if I can do that. There. I'll turn this in and then slip this in, and that'll make a nice even and not have any raw edges there. There. So then when you get that done, slip that in and then go ahead and pin it. And then you can continue on stitching into where you started stitching at the beginning. We've got our binding all sewn on now, and I'm going to suggest to you, you take your scissors and trim all these little pieces of thread off. And after we get that done, then we're going to turn it. And at this time, you'll probably want to get your iron out too. We're going to take our binding, and as you can see, it's going to have a little corner here. You may have to stretch that just a little bit, and then just press your iron on there to bring that all out as far as you can. We'll turn that, and then you'll be able to pin that there, and you could probably pin the top of the binding right on the stitch that you have made underneath. That would be about right. Now when you get to your corners, you'll see that you have a nice little miter there. So you pull that out, go ahead and press that a little bit. Then you can turn it over there, pin it also. Now this will have to be sewn by hand, but it takes just a few minutes. And you get into here, I'm going to trim a little bit more of this thread off. There. And you can see you have a nice miter. Bring this down like that, and bring this over it. There. When you do your stitching, you'll come up inside the miter just a little bit, maybe 1 stitch, and that'll hold it there. Now I'm coming into this this corner, and I see I've got quite a bit of fabric here and some thread. I'm going to trim this off, and then I'm going to take this and I'm very carefully just going to trim off that little tip of all that fabric, and then I think it'll make a much neater miter when we get around to sewing this in by hand. You get it all down and flat in the way it looks really good, and you have all your miters in, then you just take a needle and thread and whip stitch this down in place. And then it'll be ready to put on our tote when we get ready. On our next episode, we're going to start making our tote by cutting it out. So until then,